Well, I am so excited that you are tuning in to Medical Experts in Football. I'm Tawada Shigman, the host and sports journalist and physical therapist. And yes, I am finally doing both careers, so I'm really excited. But here you are in for a special treat.
If sports psychology services were available when I was playing, they would have been so beneficial to me. To have someone, what I would tell that Mariah now
Mm-hmm.
is that what I accomplished was amazing and was so much more than so many people get to do. But when you're in the moment, all you can see is what you didn't accomplish, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you gave up. I don't think that I coped poorly with it. And I don't think acceptance came for years for
Oh.
me.
Here's Dr. Mariah Bullock, a former professional soccer player in the National Women's Soccer League in the United States and a standout collegiate athlete at Stanford University, making it to the Final Four all 4 years, claiming one national title. But she's now the sports psychologist for the Canadian Women's National Team and the old reign in the NWSL. Sit back because there are some great topics for us all and a little bit about my personal experience in there, which is not the typical. To open it up, you are from Huntington Beach, California. It's known as a surf city just south of Los Angeles. How would you describe your hometown?
Yeah. So if we want to be super technical, if you have any listeners that are from Southern California or Orange County, my home is in Westminster, but my high school and my club and most of what I did was in Huntington Beach. Yes, very much a surf city. So Huntington Beach is definitely a beach town. And I would say that I loved and thrived in that environment. So it's very laid back. I'm half Polynesian, so like that was also pretty consistent of like, okay, chill vibes.
Mhm.
And we're just in our flip-flops all the time and at the beach whenever we can. Yeah, loved hanging out by the beach with friends. I didn't learn to surf until college,
Oh,
ironically.
why is
Um,
that?
because my parents didn't want me to get injured.
Get that
Like
scholarship
I know
first.
exactly. They're like focus on soccer, which is just so funny because genuinely, like your risk of injury in soccer is also pretty high. So it's whatever you
Right.
anyway. I would say the culture is you care about how you look, but you
Mhm.
don't want it to look like you care about how you look.
Isn't that just a California vibe though?
Yes, yes, exactly. So it's like, oh, I'm wearing this really casual knit sweater that probably costs $120. That's what I think of. And I think of like acai bowls and yeah, lots of dudes and stoked and chills.
Chilled. And what about dogs? Because I hear that there's the dog like surfing event. Have you been to that before? Yeah, they were talking about how at Huntington Beach they have this dog surf where the dogs are like surfing on water. It's you've never
Cool.
been there, huh?
No, I haven't. There's definitely dog beaches, and I've seen
Uh-huh.
videos of people taking their dogs on their surfboards, but I have not seen it in person. But I believe it.
Okay. During my journalism school, we had a bureau at I guess downtown LA. And then I was very fortunate to get a paid internship with Fox Sports. So I was like around kind of that LA area. And I have to say, what you said about the dress, like I felt like people wanted to look together, but like not be too overboard. And I just felt like as a Southern girl, it was just too much going on. I just need to be simple. That's my life. But
Mhm.
nevertheless, I definitely didn't think LA the vibe. I like the chill vibe at the beach, but I think overall I'm very simple. So,
Mhm.
well, what is your favorite childhood memory in California?
Oh, wow. Anything or soccer related?
Yeah, anything.
Well, I think the things that are quintessential Southern California that I think of is like my perfect day, like my perfect weekend day. I would wake up early, go to the beach, either play beach volleyball or surf with friends, get yeah, like an acai bowl or like brunch after. There's this place called the Sugar Shack that we would go
Mhm.
to and get like a breakfast burrito maybe. And
Yeah.
then just hanging out and then maybe like some pickup soccer
Okay.
with some buddies that I played with. When I think of home, I think of the weather and I think of the ocean and sunsets, and then obviously family. So I think
Yeah.
when I think of home, I've been away from home since college and haven't lived back there for a while. And so when I think of growing up, it was a lot of spending time with extended family, with cousins, just like hanging out at someone's home and like jamming on the uke and like
Yeah.
hanging out and chatting.
Seems real chill, real laid back. But you mentioned the beach. The beach was kind of a thing that you'd go to. What did you feel inside of you that made you feel such maybe at peace when you would go to the beach?
I do think it's peace. When I got further along in my psychology study in grad school, and we would do visualizations where it talks about like what's a safe place, or where's a place where you feel calm and at peace. That place for me was always the beach, especially like before I got married, because there's safety in that as well. But yeah, it was always the beach. And I think just like I can close my eyes and picture it, and the smell and the sounds and the warmth of the sun, and it's just beautiful. And there's this highway called PCH that you drive down, and I just have this image of driving down and the wind's blowing and your windows down and you're playing music, and it just makes you feel like, oh, everything, like life is good, is how I feel.
Yeah, life is good, Drake. But but you know, that's the one thing that I'm missing in Georgia, is just being able to go right to the beach. But what's crazy is that when I was in California, I thought, oh, you know, I'm going to go to the beach every day. But I got so busy, like between the production and school, even college though. Did you have time to go to the beach on a regular basis, or not so much?
I wouldn't say on a regular basis. So it's a little bit further from Stanford to get to the beach. So we would go to Santa Cruz, but it would have to be in the spring in off season on a weekend, where we would just kind of, there was probably a group of maybe like 5 or 6 of us that also enjoyed surfing. And so we would, or we could go to Half Moon Bay, but it's a little bit colder when you go north. So anyway, point of the story, there was a group of us, we would go every once in a while. And yeah, it always made me think of home, and it was always super fun.
Sweet. And then finally, food. Is there a signature food out there?
I would say no. Like, I think that in Southern California, maybe you experience this, and especially in Orange County, there's very much, at least more recently, like a health conscious mindset of, oh, we want to have things that are super organic or vegan or whatever it is. So I think that's probably the strongest culture of Orange County. There's a lot of Mexican food. So when I go home, I also like, I'm always trying to hit up taquerias. Or there's also like kind of close to where I lived, a pretty big Vietnamese population. So I would also go and get like pho or banh mi sandwiches. And so I would say those are the 2 biggest influences, but it's a predominantly white population.
Okay. So before we get into kind of that, your career and soccer, I have to mention, because I feel like we're somewhat similar, because you mentioned that your far-fetched dream is to be a backup it's to be a backup dancer for a female hip hop artist. And that is totally something I would love to do. What makes you want to do that kind of career?
Oh my goodness. It just looks so fun. First of all, I love dancing. Again, I think
me too.
Like half my culture Polynesian, the other half my culture Brazilian. And I just feel like dance was like always incorporated within both of those cultures. And I just remember like school dances or like in college. Like honestly, if I grew up in the TikTok era, I would 100% have been one of those people doing TikTok challenges. That didn't exist. So like, back when it was MTV and VH1 music videos, I would literally watch music videos and like just have them on repeat and be practicing dance moves in front of my mirror.
So you were better than me. I don't know that I had it recorded, but I would just be dancing like, but I'm probably better. I'm probably not as good as you are. You sound like you actually got like it coordinated with the songs and all that. That's impressive. All right.
So
well,
it'd be really fun. And like when I look at it, I'm like, I don't want to be in the spotlight because I do not have the talent for that. But if I can just be in throwing distance of greatness, and I'd be like, you just tell me what to do, and like I'll make you look good.
Well, I am curious, because as an athlete, even though I feel like I was fairly introverted at Mizzou, especially my first couple of years, because I came as a transfer, I felt like there was always something in me that was always curious, whether you were a bench player or you were a walk-on player. Like I always wanted to understand and get to know the people around me. And I was listening to, I guess, a YouTube video, and you were talking about how you kind of love not so much the small talk, but really getting to know people. When did you realize that? And did that make an impact on you deciding to get a major in psychology?
Yeah, so you really did your research. I would say that I didn't realize I was that way until I pursued psychology. I think throughout it was just something that was very natural to me. It was something that was really interesting to me. I, yeah, I think of sleepovers or when you're rooming together on a visit, and I was like, well, tell me about this. What do you think about this? Like really kind of deeper, controversial or philosophical questions. And
Mhm.
even in my adulthood, my husband and I had this couple that came over and we were discussing things and like, do you two ever have like light conversations? Which I do, but it's so interesting to me. Once I kind of discovered counseling and psychology as a profession, because I never thought, oh, getting to know people deeper, or asking questions and learning more about people could turn into a job. But once educationally I started taking more classes, I was like, oh, this really fits and is congruent with who I am and how I've always kind of interacted with people.
Yeah, very cool. You know, just back in the day, I feel like even when I'd go on dates with guys, I felt like I didn't know it, but I was asking these deep questions that most people are like, oh, just what's your favorite color? What do
Yes.
you like to drink? And I'm like, no, no, no. Why do you think that that is the way society is? You know, so I completely understand what you
Yeah.
mean. You spent all of your years at Stanford University, which is a top college for athletics, for education. You made it to the Final Four all 4 years, getting one national championship, which is incredible. You went on to play in the National Women's Professional Soccer League for about 2 to 3 years.
Yeah, 3 seasons.
And then you chose to return back to school to obtain your PhD in clinical psychology at a time where you technically could have kept playing. You were still at your prime.
Mhm.
Why did you choose to return back to school at that time?
Complicated answer. I always wanted to play professionally. And I went into my professional career knowing that I eventually did want to pursue a PhD in clinical psychology. So I'd already made that decision
Mhm.
going into my professional career. I loved my experience. It was the first 3 years of the NWSL. So
Yeah.
putting that into context, it's been so cool to see the growth. But at that time, I was staying with a host family
Yeah.
in their basement. We were making the base salary that they could pay someone for, I think it was maybe a 6 to 8 month season, was $6,000.
Yeah.
And and then you had nothing to do in the off season, you're unemployed. And
Right.
so that was such a grind, which I was happy to do at the time. And I think that was probably the culture within the league, is like we were just so excited and stoked that there was a league.
Yeah.
But the conditions were not great, most places, is what I
Yeah.
would say. So it was that. And then I'd also grown up in the youth national team system. And so, like many other women's soccer players, the ultimate dream is to play for the full national team. And so I also, in my mind, had that as a goal.
Mhm.
And so I was kind of shooting for a certain time within the cycle to try to break through. And I
Mhm.
never did. And I kind of got to this point of like, okay, well, do I want to try it out for 4 more years in this grind to make it? And again, kind of be scraping by financially, or there's this other path that I already know that I want to take that I think will be fulfilling, that is going to take 5 years of schooling for me to do. And I knew that I wanted to start a family. And so I was like breaking down the timeline, and I was like, I think this is kind of my time. And it was so hard. It was easier in that I knew where I was going next, which I think helps in the retirement process, but so hard in that I was like, wow, I have so much more to give physically, like mentally and emotionally to this game. But I do think that there's a power in stepping away on your own accord and at your own time. So definitely such a mixed experience for me.
And when you say it was so hard, especially knowing your potential in your mind, what needed to happen or be processed for you to really come at a place where you felt good about it? I mean, obviously you knew you wanted to become a psychologist, but your mind still has to go through that process of acceptance, right?
Yeah, honestly, and I say this all the time, if sports psychology services were available when I was playing, they would have been so beneficial to me. To have someone, what I would tell that Mariah now is that what I accomplished was amazing and was so much more than so many people get to do. But when you're in the moment, all you can see is what you didn't accomplish, right? And you gave up. I don't know that I don't think that I coped poorly with it. And I don't think acceptance came for years for me. It was a lot of, did I make the right decision? Should I go back? While I was in grad school, I was training with the Utah Royals while they were part of the league, just for fun. And it was some people that I'd played with before. They're like, hey, Mariah, like, you want to come back? And I was like, do I want to come back? I don't know. So yeah, it was a very long journey of questioning and having to just like throw myself into my decision and commit to it. And I don't think it was until later on that genuinely, until I started my studies in grad school and learning about and then practicing for myself some of the skills that I was learning, that I was able to come to a full acceptance of that decision.
And that learning, because I want to make sure listeners understand, because we're going to be talking about mental performance as well as obviously like mental health. Now, to become a psychologist, you in the States, it appears you need to get your PhD, right? And then you could specialize, have a subspecialty like you do in sports performance.
Yes. So the title of psychologist is essentially protected in that you need to have a doctoral level. So that could be a PhD, or there's another degree called a PsyD. You need to have a doctoral level degree in psychology. So that could be clinical psychology, counseling psychology. There's other subfields of psychology. And then sports psychologist is usually someone who has additional experience, training, education in more mental performance work. So one could, if you want to use the term psychologist, it's a doctoral level, but you could also do this type of work with a master's degree in counseling and a master's degree in mental performance or sports psychology. And you could still do the things that I'm doing.
Okay. But mental performance, though, you could technically have like your bachelor's, right, in psychology to actually work at like with mental performance aspect, or
I believe you need at least a master's degree.
a master's. Okay.
Yeah. Usually in sports psychology, some people go more like kinesiology route. So,
okay. Well, I have to talk about it because I was trying to do the interview before, but I realized you were heading off to the World Cup. You, like you mentioned, may have not broke through the U.S. national team on that main level. However, you had the opportunity to be at the pinnacle at a World Cup working for the Canadian national team. Overall, how would you even describe that experience?
It's hard to describe. People have asked me, and I think my story changes every time. The first thing I would say is that it's a dream come true and such an honor. The country of Australia, you could probably sense this if you were watching from the media coverage or if you were following anyone individually on social media. The country loved the tournament and embraced the tournament. And so when you were in the hubs, there was just tons of marketing and flags and merchandise and people wearing jerseys and walking around. And that was so cool. Or you could overhear people talking about it. And that was so cool. I think there's an element when you're with a national team and when you're in camp where you're in a bit of a bubble. It's not so dissimilar from when you're playing collegiately. People are like, oh, wow, yeah, you went to all these different states or you traveled so much. How was it? And you're like, I don't know, I saw the hotel and I saw the field.
Exactly. And I went to eat. That was it.
Exactly. And so there's a little bit of that in that you're still in your bubble and you're not like really in the hustle and bustle. But whether it's FIFA or Adidas or Nike or whatever sponsors, they kind of like decked out the hotel, which made it cool, or they would have merchandise, or there was this one that like thing that they had in particular that was fun where they had Nike clothing for the players and for the staff, and you could pick like a blank shirt, and then there were local artists that would come and customize it for you. So there were some people who were doing like spray painting and like ironing on different like custom patches and stuff. So it was cool in that there was just a lot more stuff. Or there were these coffee machines where you could screen print a photo in the foam to just like fun little touch.
Yeah, that's cute. That's cutesy stuff.
But the coolest part was naturally game days. And so when you walk into the state, when you'd like our bus is decked out with FIFA World Cup stuff, and you're driving through the city and everyone's like waving or booing, whatever they're doing.
Yeah.
And then you drive into the stadium and the locker rooms are decked out, and then you walk out into the tunnel and it's just thousands of people. And genuinely, even outside of the World Cup, but even more so in the World Cup, when you're standing there and we get to be on the pitch. So when you're standing there on the pitch and an entire stadium is singing a national anthem, it is so emotional for me. And I'm just like, wow, this is so cool.
I can imagine. I am curious because you being an athlete, you know what it's like to play high level competitions or games that mean a lot. Are there any additional preparations that you need to do when it comes to now going to a World Cup, working with players that are literally at the highest of height, or does your kind of approach stay the same?
I would say probably 90% my approach is the same. And I think one of the pitfalls when people either jump in a level or have a game that the outcome means more is they feel like, oh, I need to do this big drastic change, or I need to do something special. And then you get away from your preparation and what you've been doing for hours and hours and hours. And usually that hurts performance. So if you, we're talking about football. So if you have to take a penalty kick, I'm going to give you the same approach whether you are playing in a college game versus whether you're playing at a World Cup. The factors that probably shift a little bit, it's the same skill of maintaining focus, but the factors that might change is the scale, right? There's a difference.
What do you mean by that?
The scale meaning there's a difference between doing it in front of 50,000 people versus doing it in front of 2,000 people. But what you're doing is the same thing. It's just doing it in a different context, right? Yeah. So if you're doing grounding exercises or breathing or visualization, that's not going to change, but the environment changes. And so there's just like little tweaks that you would do.
Yeah.
But at its core, the same skills.
I figured, but I'm not a psychologist, so I have to ask that question. Now, in the World Cup, y'all also had mind room sessions. Was this available for all athletes, whether you had anything going on, just to kind of go in there? What is that like?
The mind room. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the mind room, at least what it's called, was created by the mental performance coach before me. And I liked it. So I was like, let's keep it. It's what the team is familiar with. But what it means is it's just individual sessions that any of the players on Team Canada are able to schedule in with me. And then we sit and we talk. And sometimes it's just about kind of general struggles or feelings within camp. Most of the time, it's more mental performance focused of how can I be best prepared for this upcoming game? Or, oh, I'm still hung up on this mistake from training, or I'm noticing myself getting frustrated with teammates or staff members. Can I manage that? And then we just do a session together where I'm listening and providing skills and validation, and we're kind of coming to some type of conclusion or problem solving together.
Okay. So after the World Cup, you said you have now moved to Utah.
Mm-hmm.
So what's your day like now? Are you within the university? I know you're still helping out with or working with O'Reilly too.
Yes. So I'm still contracted with both Canada Soccer and OL Reign, which is probably 75% of my time. And then the other 25% has been a mix of just moving and getting settled in and doing little DIY projects.
And the baby,
oh yeah,
11 months.
Yes, a baby takes up a lot of time.
Yeah.
And then I'm just picking up some private practice clients to fill in some time as well.
Very cool. Well, your opportunity with O'Reilly, I want to actually hear the story because it's cool listening to you tell about how you tweeted about something and then they reached out to you. Tell me exactly in your own
Right.
words.
This is a pretty unconventional way to get a job, but in the time of social media, shoot your shot, I guess.
Yeah.
Right. So if we rewind to COVID 2020, there was the Challenge Cup, which was a tournament within the NWSL. And the way that they handled COVID restrictions and protocols is that they sent everyone to Salt Lake City and had a bubble within there. And so people were competing in this tournament, going through the same struggles that everyone was during COVID, but trying to compete at the top level as a professional athlete, which was obviously a strain. So one of the athletes on OL Reign was taken off mid-game and then later had tweeted that they were removed due to having panic symptoms and kind of just advocating for mental health support within the league. So I saw that and I was like, yes, retweet. I quoted the tweet and mentioned the NWSL as well as OL Reign to say, hey, everyone, yes, this is a big deal. Whenever you want to start employing psychologists in the league, you find me. And I was probably 20% serious and 80% just being like, hire people. Like, this is a resource that we need. And then the owners of OL Reign got in contact with me, who were also the owners when I played there, and said, hey, Mariah, like, is this really something that you're serious about? Do you want to do this? And I was like, yeah, let's make it happen. And then we created that position, which was cool. And I think one of the first in the league, if not the first in the league.
Yeah. And being the first, creating the actual position, because there are some loopholes, there's some things of figuring out, because not all the teams have sports psychologists, or do they now?
So I believe with the newest CBA, it's required that clubs offer access to mental health services. So most teams do not have someone dedicated to their team. They'll just have referrals within the community that they'll send their athletes to. So I think, I'm very sorry if other people exist and I'd like to connect with you, but I think I'm the only person who is technically a part of the staff, like a contracted member of staff, that I'm the point person, and it just eases the barriers to connecting with these types of services.
Now, you're not at their practices, you're not there the day-to-day. What is a process like? Say they feel an athlete has something that they want to talk to about. What does that process look like to then have you get a hold of them and kind of make those connections?
Yep. So I make a point to come to preseason and meet with them there, so then they know my face. And we'll usually do a couple team activities or workshops, again, to get familiar with me, as well as like sports psychology work. All of them have my phone number and email. And at this point, what's cool, and I would say that I probably went in with the benefit of knowing, I'd say maybe a quarter of the team from my playing days.
Playing. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so there was already a degree of trust and comfort and familiarity with me and like credibility almost.
Right.
So at least initially, and again, COVID was still impacting the league where people are like, okay, I'm stressed. Let's try this out. Now, in the day to day, it's usually some type of referral process. So either the athletes themselves are like, oh, I'm struggling. Oh, yeah, Mariah is a person. And I'll try to pop in throughout the season to have other like face-to-face contacts, and so I'll come to some more games.
Mm-hmm.
But they'll either reach out to me directly, or maybe they're talking to one of their teammates and their teammates will be like, hey, I meet with Mariah and I think you might like her, which is so cool. I think the most natural and organic way that mental health stigma decreases.
Mm-hmm.
And I think our group is so good about being like, yeah, I go to therapy, or like, yeah, whether it's with me or with someone else, where they're like,
Yeah.
this is super normal. You should do it too. And it doesn't matter whether you're clinically depressed or if you're having a relationship struggle, like just go talk to someone.
Yeah.
Or maybe a staff member will message me to be like, hey, I've just noticed that blah, blah, blah looks a little bit different, or like seems down or is acting differently. Or, hey, this person had a loss within their family. Can you just do a check-in? And then I might just message them to do like a quick little check-in. So that's kind of what it looks like.
Wow. Cool. You know, I think you mentioned something that really holds true is to see people comfortable to talk about mental health, just to say, hey, I'm actually seeing a psychologist. You could check them out, because I will say, and you brought upon a good point, like, yes, the NWSL, you would expect that they would have had even psychologists, even for the first season, you know, because in college, we might not have necessarily, and like you mentioned, we might not have necessarily had a psychologist right there in the maybe athletic room, but we did have access to at least go out to seek a service, because I had to do that. And I think during my time, I don't think I ever felt comfortable to tell anyone about it, not even, and this sounds crazy, this is the first time that I'm even telling someone publicly, because I had a really bad concussion. And, you know, they projected that I should be back around a certain amount of time. I returned back, and then I'm still having these symptoms. And there was just so much behind the concussion regarding to my mood, my feelings, and trying to be a good team player, but then also looking like a bad team player, because didn't want to be around noise, didn't want to be around people. And I still remember returning back to play, knowing that I wasn't fully recovered, and just dealing with so much sadness. And just obviously, as an athlete, when you're signed to score goals as a forward, like, you want to at least be able to contribute to that. And like, I don't even think I scored a single goal that season. And fortunately, my coaches were super supportive. I will always be grateful for that university. But I remember I was just so sad inside. And it wasn't even about the goals, but it was just like something in me didn't feel right. And so my athletic trainer was like, hey, like, you know, we do have some psychology services. And what's crazy is that when I look back, I remember like telling her, yes, I want to go. And I would go there and we would sit on this nice, comfy couch. And I'm not trying to stereotype, because I know that we do more than just sit on a couch and look at a psychologist. But I remember the psychologist being just so warming. She opened the floor up for me to just share my experience. And I remember sometimes I would just sit there and I would just cry. Like, I didn't even feel like I could talk, because I was just so overwhelmed. But then I started to see her more. And obviously we talked more in depth. I felt more comfortable. And I'll be honest with you, I was really surprised that everything that we did, from just like finding out what is triggering me, why I feel the way that I feel, it wasn't even like complex conversations we were having. It was really simple questions she was asking. And it actually helped me. And like, I'm not saying that I think I was like fully like myself, like within a season, because I think that takes time and just practice, learn what some of the techniques that you learn. However, I will say, looking back, just like you mentioned, I told myself like I wish I would have went to her even longer and not felt like I needed to rush and just go to a couple of sessions and then try to be, you know what I mean? So
Totally.
for me, a sports psychologist, my whole experience at college made me realize how impactful that, you all are. And I think till this day, I still think that, I mean, not that I'm an athlete, but I think I always like to tune into sports psychologists, maybe sharing their wisdom, because the mind is still the mind, whether you're an athlete or whether you're a medical professional. So thank you for sharing that. And I am actually curious too, for you, like during your college years, how do you feel a sports psychologist could have helped you, especially during those moments that maybe it was like a national championship, or maybe it was just like the final Pac-12, those kinds of games? Or did you feel that you were pretty good? What more do you feel like you could have used?
Yeah. Well, first off, thanks for sharing your story. That was really nice to hear and cool. And I think when you were speaking, two things that came to mind where I think misconceptions with athletes in general is, one, we want results and we want results fast. And so we're like, okay, let's get it done. And then like, oh, there's some change. Great, I'm done. I don't need to do this anymore.
Yeah.
As well as, oh, there needs to be something wrong to be talking to a psychologist versus, okay, cool, I'm recovered from my concussion, but oh, there was still a benefit in having a objective opinion, or there was a benefit in having a place where like the attention, where I can just speak and get everything off my chest for an hour, or I can just cry and that's okay.
Yeah.
So anyway, again, thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
In terms of myself, in general, I would say that I was okay from a mental
Yeah.
performance standpoint. I don't think that in particular, big games and big moments didn't really faze me. And I think that came from a place of just high self-efficacy in my own abilities,
Yeah.
as well as that chill culture of, I think sometimes in our mind, we just blow up these moments as huge and like life-changing and do or die. And I was like, I'm just playing soccer. Like, it's just a soccer
Something
game.
you've been doing since you've been 6 years old. So
Yeah, which I think just came intuitively, but for others needs to kind of be learned. When I really think back of what are the skills that would have been most helpful, one, I was a captain in my last year, and I think in general, like my leadership skills could have been better. I look back at some of the things that I said or did, and I was like, well, I was 20 or however old I was.
Yeah.
But oh my gosh, I could have handled that so much better. From a performance standpoint, there's something within sports psychology called deliberate practice, which is that you are intentionally targeting something within your training. And I always wanted to be better, but the way that I approached getting better was, well, I'm just going to show up and give my best effort, right?
Yeah.
Rather than, okay, I'm going in and this training, I'm specifically targeting my communication with my other midfielders. Or in this training, I'm specifically targeting improving and switching play, right? It was like, okay, I'll just do whatever the drill gave us, right? You're like, we're doing this, versus okay, me as an individual, this is this thing that I'm doing, and these are the specific tasks that I'm doing to improve that thing.
Yeah.
And then I would also say that I was very outcome based and had black and white thinking. And so in the moments where I was like, I am not enough, or that wasn't good enough, I wasn't able to see the nuance of all of the things that I, kind of similar to when I retired. I wasn't able to see all of the nuance of the growth and accomplishments that I had made because I didn't get the end goal.
Yeah.
And that negated everything. Therefore, it was a failure. Therefore, it wasn't worth it. When in my freshman year, there were so many great players that I got to play with, and we were perfect all season until the national championship when we lost. In my young, impressionable, non-psychology mind, I was like, what's the point?
Yeah.
What's the point of going perfect if you don't win the championship, that's the only thing that matters.
Hmm.
And that's clearly not the case, but it's not something that I could see at the time.
Right. Yeah, no, I would agree. Not that I played at national championship. But yes, just a loss, and I did everything else right. The loss would just be the main thing that my mind would be on. Well, when we talk about mental health, because you again made a good point how you don't necessarily need to have something wrong to get seen. And I want to read off this definition about mental health because I think sometimes people actually aren't quite sure what it actually means. So it says it's a state of successful performance or mental functioning resulting in productive activities, fulfilling relationships with other people, and the ability to adapt to change and to cope with adversity. How would you describe mental health in your own words?
Ooh, I love that. That was great.
It was from an article, a psychology article. I'm a
Nice.
nerd like that.
Good
So,
job, whoever defined that. Yeah, it is so hard. Wow. Things that stood out to me. I liked that it was all encompassing, not all encompassing in that it's exhaustive, but all encompassing in that it's generalizable to anyone. It's generalizable to an athlete, to a mom, to an accountant, to an executive.
mhm,
I liked that. So if we think about different models within psychology, there's a medical model, which is how do we eliminate the things that are going wrong? And then there's a more positive psychology model, which is, okay, maybe we're not trying to get rid of the bad, but can we maximize the good? Right. And
mhm,
so that's what I liked about that definition is there was also this positive psychology sense of like, okay, can I have a meaningful life? Can I have meaningful relationships? Can I have flexibility within my thinking
yeah.
and health that's a little bit more holistic?
Reading that definition, would you say that mental health is somewhat like a continuum, whereas like some
Mhm.
people may have, these things, but it doesn't impact their day to day, where some people it might actually present problematic?
Absolutely, yes. I'd say most things are in some way on a spectrum, but 100% mental health. So when I'm thinking about, let's say at the university, when I'm thinking about a freshman who comes in and evaluating what their mental health is on the low end of the spectrum, in terms of severity, I might be looking at, okay, well, how are they adjusting to college, right?
Yeah.
Or like, how's their sleep? Or how are their relationships with their family or with their friends? And those aren't things that necessarily have a disorder, but it might be something that may be a bit of a struggle or they're just needing some guidance within.
Mhm.
And then further along into the spectrum, you might when you look at the criteria for a mental illness, one of the criteria is that it causes impairment or dysfunction. So if you, let's say you're anxious around people and it's just hard for you to come out of your shell and chat, that can be non-clinical. But if it gets to a point where it's like, okay, you stay in your room
That was
because
me. I'm sorry.
you stay in your room and that's getting in the way of you building relationships with your teammates, or like you really want a romantic partner but like you can't leave your room or you can't get your words out of your mouth, then it's like, oh, okay, that's something that may need a little bit more. Maybe like we're creeping into like actual social anxiety as a disorder. Like I think that
Mhm.
sometimes as a society we'll throw out words like depression, OCD, anxiety, and everyone feels those things. For it to be like an actual disorder is when it becomes more, I would say like chronic or more consistent or more impairing.
Yeah.
And then at like the highest extreme, it might be someone who is not able to function at all, and we need to put them in a higher level of care where they can have maybe like a residential treatment where they're able to focus on their healing for
Mhm.
4 hours in the day or 24 hours of the day. And it's especially difficult for athletes because you do have added demands. And so your mental health often needs to be at a higher state than maybe just a general population person or
Yeah.
student, because you're needing to perform at whatever level.
Yeah.
Whereas it's like if for me, if I'm having difficult sleep maybe in adjusting from the World Cup, it's like, oh, bummer, but I'll catch up in however long it takes me, versus someone, if you need to play a game the next day, it's so much more critical that you're addressing
Right.
that.
Yeah.
And it's urgent.
Right. Yeah, and I want to go back to me spending time in the room and it wasn't because I was like nervous to interact with people, but I was at that time, and I think it took my coach sitting me down in his office and saying, Taiwo, like, you are doing a good job, just stop being hard on yourself. But I was such a perfectionist where if I wasn't studying, I needed to be watching film. I needed to be listening to some motivational thing. And I wasn't going to go be social with my teammates or like when they would hang out with the football players. And I didn't even realize that was kind of, not that I was not trying to be a team player, but it was kind of taking away from some of the experiences I could have had as an athlete. So it really wasn't until my coach, which I still appreciate him so much, because I tell people that he changed me, because he made me see that some of these habits that I had, not that it was like, oh my gosh, super bad, but it was impacting the relationships that I could be building with other people. So I am curious, because that begs a question, like every athlete that even enters, whether it's a collegiate system or a professional system, do you feel that they should be assessed whether they feel that they have an issue or not?
Yeah. So at the University of Nebraska, we had there's different types of symptom measures, like objective symptom measures. We use the CCAPs, and we would collaborate with the medical staff to administer in the same way when you have like a medical exam when you first show up, or like a physical, or we check in. We administer that mental health questionnaire to get a sense of, and then it makes it really simple. There's like a green, yellow, and a red. And based off of wherever they come, there's certain steps or protocols of checking in, whether that's with their medical staff or them being referred to us to kind of follow up. It can be time intensive, and I don't think that every school has the resources for that, but I think that it's good at identifying mostly kind of like present symptoms. And then for teams, like let's take, for example, American football team that was seen as maybe a higher priority within the collegiate system because of their revenue. They would have every single one of their either freshmen or newcomers, like transfer athletes, have a meeting with us just as, hey, get to know you. And we get a little bit of their mental health history. So that's like best practice, in my opinion.
And that is normally, that's not something that, like, say a clinician, like a physical therapist, is going to administer. Normally the sports psychologist is going to administer that.
If it's going to be an intake session, then it'll be a mental health professional. If it's just the questionnaire, then I believe depending on the questionnaire, the medical professional is able to administer it. But let's say someone endorsed suicidal ideation, that's something that they would then have to send to us. But if it's just like, oh, this person seems to be feeling a little down, then they could maybe ask some follow-up questions.
Okay. And then finally, about mental health before we jump into mental performance. So mental health isn't necessarily the absence of the mental disease, but it's also a place where, people will recognize their strengths and capabilities. And I guess for an athlete, what does that process actually look like to get to the point where you are able to truly recognize your strength and what you are capable of to execute at the highest level?
To piggyback on what I said earlier, I had a high level of self-efficacy kind of just from growing up. And I want to say it was probably a combination of feedback from coaches and family who were like, yes, Mariah, we believe in you and we think that you're great at X, Y, and Z, which in some ways was super empowering and helpful. And I think also in other ways kind of boxed me in of like, this is the type of player that I am, right? Yeah. Oh, I'm the type of player who's very strong and wins balls in the air and likes to distribute and likes to like break up plays defensively, which was cool. But then it was, kind of back to that deliberate practice. Then I never explored or strengthened other pieces of my game. And I think there's always that balance of own your strengths as well as hone your weaknesses, right?
Yeah.
For me, a combination of getting the feedback from people that I trusted within my environment, and then being able, I kind of see life as a series of experiments. So it's like, okay, well, if there's this thing, I'm going to try it out. And how did that go? Oh, I'm usually successful at that thing, which is going to then build my own confidence in myself and be able to be like, okay, this is a strength of mine.
Yeah, I would say for me too, I think definitely early on, like getting feedback from like coaches, from people saying, hey, you're good. But then obviously, like you mentioned, I think the self-efficacy and building also, I think confidence and self-love within yourself, that really helped me. Well, when we talk about mental health and transition to mental performance, what is the biggest difference from mental health and mental performance?
You know, there is a lot. If it's a Venn diagram, there's a pretty heavy overlap. And I think it actually sometimes causes problems because let's say you're a mental performance coach and you're like, great, I work on mental performance, knowing where that line falls of, oh, I need to now transfer that person over. Because let's take performance anxiety. Like anxiety is in the word, right? And so a mental performance coach can train composure, right? And probably talk about self-talk. And it's in the setting of performance. When does it transition into mental health? Super sticky and gray.
Yeah.
I think for sure there's a line when it becomes clinical. And at that point, or if it's, let's say, maybe trauma related or substance use or disordered eating related, it's like, okay, well, that's for sure something that's a little bit more mental health. Mental performance to me is more about mindset and tools specific to maximize performance.
Okay. So does mental health take precedence over mental performance in a sports setting?
In my opinion, yes. Maybe other people would say no.
Yeah.
But I would say that mental health is going to affect performance more than mental performance is going to affect mental health, if that makes sense. So I would always, if it's a hierarchy, I always want to make sure that someone's mental health is right and in a good place.
Yeah.
Before we start working, like, okay, right. If someone is depressed, then I'm going to treat the depression before I'm going to work on your goal setting.
Right. And this is what I want to know, because when you're working with this athlete during the season, what do they actually need to understand? Because like for me, I was like, I need to get better within 3 weeks before the postseason to be all good to go. What do you think athletes need to understand regarding to that process, whether it's you're addressing that mental health or mental performance, and what do they need to know to continue to get better and continue to almost make these habits a consistent thing, that it's their day-to-day performance?
You nailed it on the head there, in that it does need to be consistent. I think that we do this with like technical skill building as well. We're like, okay, cool. Well, I can do this skill, so then therefore I no longer need to practice it. Or like, oh, I've achieved it successfully once, and so like I no longer need to. So I guess I would start with humility, which is that everyone can be better.
Yeah.
It's not just for, again, people who are struggling or people who are finishers. Like 1 to 26 on the roster can benefit from doing some type of mental performance work, and it can show incremental improvements from wherever your starting point is. I would say that finding a therapist or finding a counselor or coach that is a good fit for you and for your personality and for your learning style makes a huge difference. And so it's like, okay, well, if you don't vibe with that particular person, don't just throw it out the window.
Right. That's
And
good.
then I think it's important as a clinician that although it's not going to change overnight, if you can provide a skill or a tool that provides some quick outcome that they can feel and see and notice, then that's also going to make things easier for them to continue. So if I give someone a tool and they're like, okay, cool, yeah, I went back and I did that thing and like, oh, I got a different result, and like that, or like, oh, that felt really good, then they're going to be more motivated to keep trying.
Yeah. So clinicians being able to maybe provide some kind of measurement assessment that athletes can objectively see their progress too. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think objective measures are great, but even like subjective. So if
Subjective.
so the other day I was working with someone, yeah, just on composure and teaching them how to do breathing and muscle relaxation in a way that calms them down when they're getting anxious and stressed. And I think anytime you talk to someone about breathing, you want to roll your eyes because you're like, okay, Dad, just breathe. But when you can teach it in the right way and explain how to apply it, and then we came back our next session and they're like, oh my gosh, I was getting really heated with someone. And then I did the breathing, the muscle relaxation, and then it just gave me a moment to pause. And like I felt a little bit calmer and then I was able to
Yeah.
react better. And they're like, oh, okay, cool. So maybe this thing can help. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And half the time people say, oh, I don't have issues breathing, but they actually don't use the correct muscles to actually breathe.
Yeah, right.
So
Exactly.
the other question that I have regarding to mental performance. So when we talk about like before or pre-performance phase, during the performance, and then after the performance, maybe can you give me an idea of just some generic things that athletes could implement during those phases?
Yeah, cool. So if I'm thinking about pre-performance, I'm thinking about routines. Let's say it's pre-training or especially pre-match. What does that day before or day of leading up to look like? And can you come up with not a superstition, but like a routine of, okay, I do this and this and this and this, and it prepares my mind and my body to then be ready to go when it's time to go. And that's going to be different for everyone. What I actually find most frequently is that athletes will be too engaged too early. So they're like, I need to be prepared. And so they're like watching film and thinking about the game for hours on end. And then by the time
Yeah,
you get the game, you're exhausted and you're probably wound up, right?
that was me.
but but it comes from a good place, right? It's like, well, I want to
Right.
do all that I can to be ready. But anyway, so whatever that routine is, like leading into performance. I think another common tool that's good pre-performance is also some form of like visualization, or if you're connected with an analyst, having like highlight reels, whether that's in your mind or like a literal highlight reel that you can be watching that can remind you of like positive experiences that are going to get you in a nice confident state. In the match or in performance, I think that probably one of the most important skills is how you respond to mistakes. And so I would be thinking about different focal cues, or again, it could be a routine as well. When you make the mistake, that helps you get out of your head, get out of the past, and be
Yeah.
more present focused and be more task focused. And I think a lot of times what we find when people are making mistakes is that you start to hide and shrink because you're like, well, I don't want to mess up again, either for myself or for the team. So it's just better if I don't ever get the ball. But
Yeah.
then it's creating a vicious cycle of, wow, I'm not doing anything and I'm useless. And why am I even on the field? And then you're more likely to get subbed off because you're not doing anything, rather than like
Yeah.
re-engaging and like taking up more space, which is going to eventually play you back into the game.
Yeah.
So
That's
that's what
good.
I'd say mostly within performance. And then post performance, I the more I'm talking, I'm like, wow, I love routines. But it's more that it just what I do love is just like intentionality and not letting things happen, because if we let things happen, especially if we don't have a good solid default foundation, then our brain is wired to like think the worst, right? And prepare for the worst and identify
Yeah.
threats. And so post match, I think it's really important to have a good routine or number of skills that helps you to evaluate the game in a way that's helpful. So I think, first of all, it's important to know how much time I need to pass before I evaluate. Are you the type of player where you need to watch the game right away? Are you the type of player who needs some space and like maybe needs to watch it the next day?
And that's something the player probably only can come to find out on their own, right? Like
Yeah, but
maybe.
again, it's something where you probably don't think about it. You're like, oh, well, I have
Mm,
some time now, so I guess I'll do it. But if I'm working with someone, I'm like, okay, well, how does it feel when you do it right after? And they're like,
yeah.
I'm so emotional that like I'm only seeing it through this lens, right?
Yeah. Oh,
So it's more like convenience rather than this is what's going to give me the best outcome.
that's interesting that you say that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I actually like that. Even when it comes to, even as a therapist, sometimes we'll do these assessments and maybe an athlete didn't quite do a jump test or whatever the correct way. Maybe taking a minute or two just to
Mhm.
let them do something else and then coming back to show them maybe their dysfunctional movement pattern. So I'm going to actually implement that as a
Cool.
clinician. Now,
Cool.
because there are a lot of clinicians that are actually working with injured athletes, I do want to just take a little bit of time just to get your insights on that. So, when we are considering mental performance and injured athletes, certainly the athletes have their family, their loved ones, parents and coaches, clinicians who are also going to be seeing them day to day. But what role can these outsiders help in helping an athlete not necessarily do the skills to improve their mental performance, but maybe the words that they may use to the
Mhm.
athlete, whether that's just in a general conversation?
Nice. I would say first and foremost that support and warmth is so key, which I think most people at least want to be doing. And I think that, like you were describing, I think concussions are especially really difficult. It can be so isolating. And
Yeah.
so if you can make sure that they have that social support, if you can try to keep them connected, if they're a member of a team, like try to keep them connected with the team as much as possible so that they don't feel like their training schedule is completely separate to the rest of the team, or they're not able to make team functions because they're having to do rehab separately, things like that. I think that's important. I think it's really important to help them stay present focused. It's easy to look backwards and be like, gosh, I used to be able to do that and now
Yeah.
I can't, which makes you frustrated. Or it's
Mhm.
really easy to look forward and be like, oh my gosh, I still have 3 more months of rehab. I'm never going to get there. Or like, oh, I really have to push so hard to make sure that I meet this deadline that I've been given.
Yeah.
So when you can stay present or just like 1 or 2 steps ahead to be able to be again more process focused of like, okay, maybe right now I'm running at 70% of my body weight. I can get really frustrated about that, or I can be like, okay, well, look how far I've come in this month or so that I've been working. And what do I need to do to be my best at this 70% body weight? Or what can I be doing that's going to get me to that next milestone? So when we can be a little bit more present or just like short-term focused,
Mhm.
always with the long-term in mind, but more short-term focused, then it helps us to get the most out of where we are
Yeah.
rather than getting frustrated.
Mhm.
Uh, and then I would also encourage those athletes to either talk to or read about other athletes who have either gone through a similar
Yeah.
injury or just been injured and out for a while in general. Because I
Mhm.
think it's easy to get hopeless, or a worry is I'm never going to be able to get back to what I was or perform at a high level. And
Yeah.
so we can have the shared experience of like other people going through the same thing or having already gone through the same thing or having gone through it and then come out on the other side. It
Yeah.
can provide hope and again, like not feeling so alone in the moment.
That's good. And during that whole explanation, I felt like I was even thinking about an athlete. And even for me, I came to understand this more as a clinician, how even an injury is really a grieving process. The athlete goes through these phases. And I feel like if I was an athlete, knowing that, like the whole denial, anger, bargaining, to then go all the way to acceptance, I think I would have been more easier on myself.
Yes.
And I just think when you're so young, when you're just really focused on the performance, why is it important to understand that this process does need to happen for you to kind of get through the injury and be able to perform at your peak performance?
Yeah. First off, yeah, thanks for bringing up the grief piece because it is very, very similar and people go through the same process. And I think that maybe like early on or when you're younger, you only attribute grief to death.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, grief can be felt in lots of different types of loss, and there is a loss of like identity and purpose with an injury. Again, like I said earlier, patience is not always a skill in athletics. And
I
so
know.
knowing one, that it's a process that's going to take time, and two, that I can't force the process, because I think that's what happens when we're trying to heal, whether it's emotionally or physically. We're like, well, if I just work harder, then this thing will happen faster. And
Mhm.
that's not how healing from grief works.
Yeah.
Like, yes, I would
Yeah.
love to just jump to acceptance, but like, you can't.
Yeah.
So I think it, one, provides expectations for athletes, which is super helpful. And then I think the other big piece is that it just normalizes it. So it's like, oh, well, why don't I feel anything? Why I'm in this state of shock? Like, I feel like I should have a bigger reaction to it, to have someone, either a professional or someone else who's gone through it, to be like, oh, no, like, that's super normal, that's part of the process. It just makes you feel like, oh, there's not something wrong with me, or
Yeah.
like, people will be like, oh, I'm not crazy, is what a lot of people will say.
Yeah. I mean, I know for me, I'd just be like, I'm just not going to talk to anyone and I'll just deal with it myself. And yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
Mm-hmm.
once an athlete has returned back to the pitch, maybe they've done their full rehab recovery, they say that even a couple of months into the season, some athletes may still exhibit, whether it's anxiety or sadness. So for these injured athletes that have actually integrated with the team,
Mm-hmm.
and from the outside, it looks like they're doing just fine. From
Mm-hmm.
your experience, what has been the biggest challenge for injured athletes who have returned back
Mm-hmm.
to the team, but
Mm-hmm.
have yet to get to their peak performance?
Mm-hmm. I think what I hear the most often, if they're coming from an injury, is they don't quite trust their body yet.
Mhm.
In some ways, it's also a trauma, right? Like a physical trauma. And so when they're asked to go back into that setting where they experience that trauma, there's going to be fear, there's going to be avoidance, there's going to be maybe like flashbacks. And so there's that worry of, well, what if I re-injure? I don't know if my body can do this. I need to be able to, again, like, trust that I can sustain contact or this type of movement. And so that's, I think, one of the bigger things that I'm usually working on with. It's like one of the last steps of like, okay, I'm back
Yeah.
in training, but I'm not quite myself. It's usually that piece. And so then I'm working with them with that, in collaboration with athletic medicine.
Finally, last topic, because I wanted a topic that, well, truly everyone can relate to all the topics, because I know I can.
Mhm.
When we talk about self-awareness
Mhm.
within first an athlete, say they have a mental block, maybe they missed a penalty
Mhm.
in a big time game, and they need skills to get through that block to hopefully be successful in future PKs. First, what is self-awareness? And then how does that help an athlete get through those mental blocks? Certainly there's other things that need to happen, but specifically self-awareness.
Yeah, agree with you. I think self-awareness is one of, if not the first step, when I'm thinking about either mental health or mental performance.
Mhm.
What is it? Self-explanatory within the word, but an internal awareness of, I would say, both like your physical, mental, emotional state in the present. That's at least how I would briefly define it. How do we develop it? Sometimes it's, for some people, it seems to come pretty naturally. For other people, kind of like we talked about, it needs to come from others pointing it out, like, oh, hey, you seem to do this, and this seems to be a patterned response in this situation. Like, let's take penalties, or maybe just shots on goal, because that's something that happens more frequently. Like, oh,
Yeah.
every time after you miss a shot, I notice that you stop checking back to get the ball at your feet, or like you stop making runs in behind.
Mhm.
That brings it to awareness for the person, right?
Yeah.
And then let's say it's still something that you don't quite notice, then I'm looking at, okay, cool, can we be tracking that behavior? If you know it's around certain times, can we maybe in that post-match or post-performance reflection look back and like, oh, how did I do at that thing that I'm specifically trying to work on? So then it's more front of mind. Why is that super, super important? Is that you can't make a change if you don't know it's wrong.
Yeah.
Like it's pretty simple. Like even with it, like even outside of sport, if you're in like a relationship, whether it's romantic or just a friendship or a family member, and behind your like you're cool when you're hanging out with that person, then behind your back they're like, gosh, Taiwo's like always just running her mouth. You know what I'm saying? And you think everything's fine.
Yeah, that is such a great example.
So, I mean, it would be great if we could notice it, but we can't always. And so it has to be from someone else. But it's like, okay, great. First step is I see that I do this thing. Second step is I would like to make a change. And then it goes into the behavioral change after that.
And then for the clinician, since they may not actually be out there seeing these athletes perform, are there any strategies that, or maybe things that we could per se ask an athlete? Okay, how's your performance? What did you do well? What did you not do well to help?
So when you say clinician, you like any type of clinician?
I would say clinicians that are making contact with them, whether they're injured, whether that's a doctor, physical therapist, someone that is providing care to them.
Yep. Perfect.
Aside from psychologists, obviously.
Yeah. Yep. Got you. So I would probably be asking questions like, let's say you notice something and you're curious about it. I would be asking questions like, oh, what was going through your mind after that event? Or how did you notice? Like, I'm always thinking about like thoughts, behaviors, feelings. Like, what did you feel after that event emotionally? Like, what are some emotion words that like were brought? And then how did you act? How did you behave as a result of that thing? Because those are things, again, we just do them subconsciously. But it's actually really interesting. Oftentimes I'll be like, oh, what was going through your head? And they're like, I have no idea.
Wow.
You know, but now because I don't know, I can be like, oh, just pay attention next time. Right?
Yeah, because I don't think that people asked me that when I was an athlete. What was going through your head? That's true.
No, because they just want to get whatever. I'm getting like a little bit on my soapbox, but I do think
no, I love it.
Sometimes coaches or staff members, whomever, will see something and then they'll make an assumption about the why.
Yeah.
And then they'll create an answer. But I think it's starting to transition more so into this now, but like we don't ask the athlete.
Yeah.
Right. It's like, okay, that was a poor session. Were you tired? Were you stressed? Was it a bad drill? Had we loaded you too much earlier in the week? Like there's so many different things.
That's good. So. I like that. Well, what are you most proud of with sports psychology progression and the profession? What are you most proud of, and what more would you like to see?
I'm so excited and optimistic about the profession. When I first was thinking about going into it and I spoke to some mentors or just psychologists at the university, everyone was like, there are no sports psych jobs. Be a general psychologist and get some specialty training. And if something shows up, awesome. But now I'm on a couple like sports psych email lists, and I just feel like there's jobs popping up all the time. And I'm pretty sure there's more jobs than there are people to fill it. And so
that's a good
I'm like, this is so exciting that people care. They see the value in it. There's opportunity. And because there have been more of us, there's more visibility that hopefully inspires other people to pursue it as well. So I think that like we're just on the come up, and it's super exciting.
I'm excited too. And what inspires you and makes you feel so fulfilled with first being with the athletes, working with them, and then being a sports psychologist? Because I'll be honest with you, even me as a former athlete, haven't got my doctorate in PT, sometimes people assume, oh, like if you're an athlete, you're just going to simply maybe be a coach, but you actually are still working with soccer, but then you're also doing a profession you absolutely love.
Yeah, it is awesome. The things that are most inspiring and fulfilling, it for me has always been the personal connection with the players or the people. Like, yeah, I also meet people who are not athletes, but there's something so beautiful about just like sitting in a room and getting like the raw, authentic person.
I hear you.
And my personal style of therapy is like, I don't want to be the therapist from the movies where I'm like hiding behind a desk with like a
The
pen and
notepad.
paper. I want to be myself and I want to respond like myself. And I want them to feel like my genuine care for them. And so that's amazing. And then when you build that relationship and they're going through something and something from your work together with them leads to better quality of life is amazing. And if I could bottle that and like drink that every single day, I would.
That was good. I didn't tell you though, if I didn't become a physical therapist, I would have done psychology because anytime I talk to psychologists, you guys just make me feel like a new person. Now, for listeners, because some may end up needing services,
Yeah.
for you, are you only working with collegiate and professional athletes, or do you do sessions with people that just say, hey, like I'd love to check in with you about a particular issue, or where would you direct them if you might not be a direct access for them?
Yeah, I got you. So yeah, I would call myself a generalist, which is that I am trained to treat a range of disorders and issues and struggles.
Mhm.
I am available to be seeing some people that are not on the teams that I work with in general to seek out psychology services. I'm not sure how it works internationally, but at least within the US, we would go through our health insurance is probably the best path first,
Okay.
because therapy can be expensive. And I think that that's probably the biggest barrier right now to
Mhm.
access is the cost. And so I would go through my insurance and then find providers in the area
Yeah.
that are covered. And then another thing about psychology, and now as a result of COVID, telehealth and teletherapy has become a much bigger thing.
Yeah.
And so if you prefer in-person therapy, cool, but there's also a lot of good research that shows that teletherapy is just as effective. And there's different types of licensure that can practice across lines. Um, some people can also look at Psychology Today, and there will be clinicians that are listed there. Ask around
Yeah.
people that you know that may see someone. Again, like the biggest thing is that it's a good personality fit and that you feel comfortable with that person.
That's
I
good.
think that those are the main ways that, and then there's also community mental health centers, at least in the US. And so those are usually a little bit more affordable and exist within most non-rural communities.
Nice. You provided a lot of resources. Well, Mariah, I cannot say thank you enough for all of your insights from your playing days, your wisdom, your advice as a psychologist. And I have to say that even though we will probably never get called to be a backup dancer, the next time we meet, we could always just do a little dance together.
That would be amazing. That'd be so fun. No, it's
Uh,
Taiwo, I appreciate it. And I think you come as advertised and that you ask thoughtful questions. And that you could totally, if you needed to do a shift into psychology, I think that you could be great at it.
and I have a resource too, so I am all for it.
Thank you again for tuning into this episode with Dr. Mariah Bullock. Please make sure that you rate and share with your colleagues because, as usual, more great content will keep coming your way.